Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is the 1950s. Let's get into it. We're going to talk about 5 terms that, as you read more about the history of American sport and gaming, you can understand kind of broader elements of kind of the culture of the 1950s. If somebody's living at this time, kind of what would have been some of the other things that are, of course, going to be going on. And the goal is to be able to provide you with some context and gateway to be able to learn more. So the first is highways. All right, highways. So we're talking mid to late 1950s. Their development and growth, of course, is going to go through the 60s and into the early 70s. But the introduction of interstate highway systems, when this legislation is going to be enacted in the 1950s and when this is going to start to be developed, really will, for Americans who are living at that time, mean a transformation of how folks thought about where they're living, where they could live, the communities that they could engage with or be a part of. And that is certainly going to have implications eventually for young people, for others who are going to be now, in some cases, living or growing up in communities that are not necessarily as close or attached to perhaps where their parents worked or where, some of their earlier family may have been living in, let's say, a larger urban space. Highways, of course, would be connected to the rising car culture of this era. And so that would also lead us into discussions of auto racing and, that kind of sporting culture, which is going to only grow in prominence by the 1950s and 60s. The second term for us, of course, is going to be suburbs. Track suburbs like Levitt towns and others are going to be developed here. Now, suburbs, of course, were not new. There were, of course, communities on the outskirts of cities, of course, for many centuries all over the world. However, in the U.S., in the 1950s especially, so you'd had this kind of pent-up consumer demand because of the Great Depression, because of the Second World War, so that by the time the war comes to a close, and you have on this the GI Bill and access to better loans, you're going to see a greater desire on the part of many to be able to purchase now what they could afford, single family homes that are going to grow in communities all over the country. And those new suburban communities are going to, of course, have their own distinct sporting cultures that we'll certainly get into. Now, another term for us with this, of course, is going to be mortgages or taxes. Now, the idea of being able to live in these kinds of suburban communities. Now, let's, of course, acknowledge many of these had problematic policies when it comes to racially restrictive policies where it made it difficult for individuals who were not white to be able to get loans and to be able to purchase homes in many of these communities. And that, of course, is not okay. And many of these communities also are deeply gendered, and there's other, issues and difficulties that would surround that. For those who were purchasing in these communities, that process became somewhat easier in that you could write off some of the interest with the mortgage on one's taxes. Now, with the 1950s, so you've got, suburban communities are growing, right? So you're going to see a lot of new single-family home construction. You're going to see folks moving, right? So folks migrating from cities to suburbs, from rural areas to cities to suburb, like that kind of thing. Is that migration process is going on all over America. you're still also going to see conflict, right? So in the 1950s, it would have been very possible for family members or part of the community to be connected to either military service because the draft is still ongoing. It would have been also very possible for someone to be part of the military during the Korean War, right? So the Korean War begins in 1950, goes all the way to 1953. Now, the war itself doesn't necessarily end, right? But major combat operations by 1953 have ended. The other thing, of course, is going to be rights struggles. 1953, 1954, this is the era of the Brown versus Board of Education cases. 1955, 1956, 1957, this is going to be the era of the Montgomery bus boycotts. This is going to be the era of the Little Rock Nine, the integration of Little Rock Central High School. And you're having conversations locally and nationally, of course, about aspects of race, civil rights, integration, and kind of discussions about the nature of community and race in America. So this would have been a part of that process for individuals who are living in the 1950s. Thanks so much.